This is Tom Fox. The Hill Country Podcast was recently honored with the 2022 Communicator Award for Distinction for Society and Culture, as well as Lifestyles for Podcasters. Today, Louis Amestoy returns to discuss the recent local elections in Kerrville. The Hill Country Podcast is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
The Texas Hill Country is one of the most beautiful places on earth. In this podcast, recent Hill Country resident Tom Fox visits with the people and organizations that make this one of the most unique areas of Texas. Join Tom as he explores the people, places, and their activities of the Texas Hill Country.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and we're back in our outdoor studio today at Starbucks on the Junction Highway, and have back with me Louis Amestoy. Louis, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for coming back on the pod.
Yeah, thank you for having me again.
So, Louis, what I really wanted to sit down to visit with you today about is your reflections on I think it was the first local election that you've been through since you've been back and started to lead, and maybe what you thought about the races, what you thought of the candidates, and then, of course, the final election results.
Well, it was a fascinating election on multiple levels. You know, you had the city council race in Kerrville, which was highly competitive in sort of the messaging. Underlying that, you also had a bond election for Proposition A, which was the city's attempt to pass a $45 million general obligation bond to pay for a 69,000 square foot public safety building, which would house the police station, the Kerrville Fire Administration, the Kerrville Municipal Court, IT, and the Emergency Operations Center. This was a huge deal, and this was an issue that was highly politicized in 2021 when a citizens group got together and blocked the city council from issuing what they call certificates of obligation to start the process of building the police station, which has been long discussed in Kerrville. And that was probably one of the most interesting ones because it's by far the biggest bond that Kerrville's ever attempted from the municipal level. On top of that, you also had school board races that were contested for the first time in a decade. You had another race in Ingram. You had school board races in Ingram. You had a bond election in Ingram for the school district there, which was $25 million. And then you also had a really tight race for the Ingram City Council. So big races all along, and the outcome didn't necessarily surprise me, but the kind of the bitterness of the election was telling in some ways.
So let's start with the city council and mayoral races. Mm-hmm. We had, I think, at least two candidates, both for mayor and the city council positions. They seemed to agree on most things, although there was obviously some difference. But I guess what struck me was what you brought up, which is sort of the tone of the campaign. And the candidate that eventually won as mayor really almost took a kind of above the fray, it seemed like to me, attitude. She was very popular and seemed to be running not to lose, as opposed to the candidate who did lose, who attacked, and some pretty significant allegations came out against him and financial problems he may or may not have had, or legal problems in other businesses came out near the end of his campaign.
Right. You're talking about Judy Eichner, who won the race for mayor, and then Bretton Bates, who was challenging Judy in that race. Bates is a developer here in town. He came out as a real populist. He's mired in numerous business practices that that he's been issued judgments for almost over $500,000 from two elderly couples. Two of them, one of the couples now deceased, that he never paid them back their investments. That there was a promise, so basically they were loans. He never paid them back. The family in one of the situations wanted judgments against him, but it took us a long time to kind of nail that down, and unfortunately it wasn't until the Thursday before the election we were actually able to publish a story about Bates's legal dealings. But earlier in the election, he came out as a populist. He came out as we're going to cut property taxes. I'm going to hold the city accountable. I'm going to get rid of planning and zoning. Essentially, we're going to go. Houston can do it. Why can't we? That was the kind of the mentality that he had going into it. He played on that sort of populist idea that I can get things done because I'm a really good businessman. Well, when you pull back the curtain on his dealings, well, that's an argument that I ended up having with him on my show on May 2nd. Judy Eichner, though, historically, her win was basically in line with what she's done in her two other previous campaigns. She actually has recorded the most votes in a regular election and a municipal election in the history of the city. So she held a 60-40 win, basically, which has been her strong suit. She's one of the things you'll see in Kerrville that we've seen in the last two elections is that people who have length of time here and who are heavily engaged, they usually get the voters. They're the ones that get out there and get that. And in this case, you had Judy Eichner as mayor, Joe Herring Jr. as place 3 city councilman, replacing Eichner on the city council, and then Brenda Hughes. And the collective, all of them have been here for many, many years. Eichner obviously has been here for about 30 years, about the same for Brenda Hughes, but Joe Herring was born and raised in Kerrville. Owns a business here. Has written a column in the Daily Times for almost probably 30 years now on local history. So their outcomes weren't surprising. Where it got to be interesting was the attacks on the establishment. Brent Bates went out on the Harley Ballou show and said things are so bad they had to drag Herring out of retirement, and he says things aren't any different than they were in 1992 when he was the mayor. He basically claimed, Bates claimed that Brenda Hughes' husband would vote for him because he knows Buzzy better than anybody. And I mean, it was that kind of stuff over and over again. And then at the very end, they said, we're going to drop your property taxes by 40%. Well, when you try to pin them down about that, that's when it got to be really squirrely. So what does that mean exactly, guys? We're talking about Bates, Robin Monroe, and Katie Chapman Hanna, who were the challengers. They could not articulate that, And so I had them on my show, and I showed them. I said, well, this what does that mean? Are you cutting 40% from the rate? Are you cutting 40% from the taxes? Because your thing says 40% tax reduction. So does that mean there's 40% less revenue in the city government? And as you know, here in Texas, municipalities, their operations and maintenance budgets are coming directly from property taxes. So it created a really interesting dynamic that sounds good until you do the math. That was never a deliverable on the campaign. That would have devastated the city of Kerrville and moved it from being able to go forward in any direction. You're talking about gigantic cuts of millions of dollars, $4 million basically at that point. So I think the voters saw through that. The one thing I think the voters did send a message to a slight degree was that the bond issue was a little bit tighter than we probably, I thought it might be a little bit more in line with how the council decision was decided. It was like a 60-40 split in that range. It was a lot tighter than that. It was about a 9-point swing. And I think that tells the city council, it's like, yeah, we're going to give this to you, but you better manage it correctly. And that building was a huge political issue in the campaign as well. And the voters, they might have voted for Eichner and Hughes and Herring, but I think they also sent a message saying we're not totally supportive of this bond, of this structure.
So let's talk about what was in that bond, because it seemed to me to be things that, in my mind, shouldn't have been controversial. Perhaps they were, but you took a look at what was put in there in depth. And what did you see in there that intrigued you, or was this almost just bringing us up not to the 1980s, but maybe to the 2010s?
I think that's you're catching up basically at this point. And the other thing is that when you're catching up with this, I mean, if you think about this, Tom, Kerrville has never had a purpose-built police station. And the world changes. I just took the Kerrville Citizens Police Academy, which is a great class for people to learn about what's going on in law enforcement. And I did that because I wanted to inform my reporting. And you look at what they're dealing with, right? So they have one training room in that facility. There's a lot of things that the police do that are confidential in order to protect, people's rights. The accused, the victims, the police themselves, in some cases, and so that when you go into the current police station, you realize, man, this thing is grossly, inappropriate. I think in the end, what they saw was an architect came down and said, "Here's what you need. You're telling me you need this, this, and this. We need training facilities because everything has to be certified. You need more room in your patrol areas. You need more room here, and this is what we want to grow this out." So, and it also happened to coincide with the fact that the Kerrville had two new, chiefs, a new police chief, new fire chief, who had very different ideas than the previous chiefs had. And so, then they brought up the thing that I think was interesting was that Kerrville adopted new building codes that brought the building codes up to the standards that essentially the rest of the state, the rest of the country are up. And this is the 2018 building code standard. And part of that standard was that you have to have a fortified building within a building to protect your people from any kind of disaster. Think of it as a in-house bomb shelter that can serve as a command center as well. And all of your things have to be sort of duplicated, plumbing, all of it has to be in there. It has to be hardened. It has to be separate from the building. So you put all of that in there, and suddenly you get this, the costs go up. They go up substantially. You look at, they also decided that, we need to have the IT move into this building too, because 75% of IT's response is directed at the police department, almost exclusively. Fire department would be second in that. And when you go into this current police station, and the thing that's telling to you is when you go into not the patrol areas, not the offices, dispatch, which is the command center of the city. So they have pretty modern equipment, current software and technology to keep their guys safe and in communication, but they're jammed into a little room that is grossly inappropriate for their needs. And you can't grow with that. You can't build on that. It's not anywhere near where they need it to be. And that was one of the areas where it really struck me. So you'd hear these people who would say, "Well, you know what? We don't need all that stuff. We don't. This is a gilded palace. This is this and this is that." It's like, no. What do you guys live in the modern era? We're talking about massive consoles. Not like it used to be though. It's not like we have like gigantic, mainframe computers in the back, but you need space and you need some room. And the other thing too is that you have to mitigate for COVID-19, and that was another issue where you had to have a little more room than you wanted to look at. The amount of misinformation about that building that was spread by Liberty in Action, We the People, Liberty in Action, which is a far right wing group, was stunning, and I think anti-police to a lot of degree, because what I think the police were asking for was basically, we need a rectangle-sized building. We can put all our stuff in. We need a municipal court. We need to keep the fire command. We want to have a unified command in case of an emergency. At one point, I didn't know how they were going to do it, and I worry too, Tom, that it may not be enough money. And you start thinking about some of the things that we're seeing, and that's another concern of mine. So $45 million felt right, and I always say the comparison, I go, it's not quite the same, but Peterson's building a 43,000 square foot surgery center for $43 million. Okay, not completely the same, but very similar as far as that goes. And this was the best option that they had out of all of the things they were facing. And considering the fact that their hands were tied on buying property before interest rates went up, really kind of made this one made sense. Where they're going to put it at, which is over on Clearwater Paseo, in that area, and across the street from the sheriff's department. So those are things I think that were a win for the community. Now, the community also lost because they're going to pay more for this than they probably anticipated. It will be expensive. And that was, to me, the fault of this misinformed group that took inflated debt numbers that weren't real and told people that the city was going to be, $100 million in debt, which isn't true at all, and scared people. And only 5% of the voters needed to approve that to stop the city from doing the kind of the work we elected the city council to do in the first place. So it's a long-winded piece of it, but that's how we ended up with this bond election.
In addition to the election, we had perhaps one of the best preliminary fireworks show around planning and zoning that we've had in some time, and that was the new housing development that went to planning and zoning over by Comanche Trace. I can't remember the name of the development.
It's called the Reserve at Kerrville.
Reserve at Kerrville. Yeah. And I was really intrigued, one, to see the planning and zoning completely punt on it, but the way the arguments lined up pro and con is things that I think we have both seen in our time here. And how do we begin maybe to think through what's the right answer? So let me start with kind of what I saw as an outsider. Yeah. Obviously, Comanche Trace, people were out in force talking about increased traffic, talking about decrease in property values. The developers were there talking about achievable housing in ways that is currently unavailable. But the thing that concerned me was the number of variances they asked for. Now, you could ask for a variance because you've got too rigorous a system, and you do need variances. But when you come in with a request for 6,000 variances, something's broken, and I'm not quite sure what it is. Maybe what did you see in all that?
Well, what I saw was a horrible presentation by the developer. Basically pie in the sky as usual for developers. Making this, we're going to do this and this, and this is going to be really cool. We're going to have a brewery and a vineyard and all this other nonsense. I think really what they should have done was they should have come out and said, not to tell them what they need to do, but I mean, if I'm doing that, I'm in the external communication on that, I'm going there and saying, look, here's the deal. We could do it this way by just taking out these hills, but we don't want to do that. What we need to do, we need the variances to protect the open space we think that makes this facility, this area unique, and to do that, we're going to need variances to develop it properly and to develop it in pods and pockets that make sense versus basically taking out all these hills or leveling or grading. They said at the end, we're trying to avoid as much grading as possible, which is tough to do in the hill country. You can look around at several projects here and you're like, man, they just ripped that thing apart. And like I just said before, I'm a dumb, California godless liberal, but that's what we did there in Southern California. Man, they just took hillsides off, boom, and what happens when you take off hillsides like that? Well, it creates chimneys and fires and all that kind of stuff. So you could have that. You could have that kind of development, that kind of high density development where they say, you know what, I don't care about this. I'm gonna build a house, make it as flat as possible. We're gonna build. I think what they were asking really for was, like, we want to have this to have some character. We want it to be spread out. We want it to have zones of high density, but we don't want it to be on top of each other. I don't think they communicated that effectively during that. And P&Z, the Planning and Zoning Commission, Mike Sigerman, who's the chairman of that, really struggled to wrap his head around the number of variances that they were asking for. And he's like, I want to see what it looks like. And they were like, well, we'll show you when we get to the platting. Because once they show them in the platting, then I think that starts, there's a debate there about some land use law that was in Texas, like whether or not once they put platting in place, what does that start the clock on approvals, things like that? Because, it's, the law is very favorable to developers. And if you get in a situation where that developer has the ability to develop without any kind of oversight, then you'll have some real issues. I mean, the biggest concern I think people are going to have right now is this arterial road they're proposing that runs through runs through the bulk of the development that connects Highway 173 and Highway 16. That's Medina and Bandera highways. That should be a 4-lane road, 2 lanes in each direction. It sounds like they might have been retreated from that. I think the city really needs to hold their feet to the fire on that one and ensure that happens, because that would be a traffic disaster if you didn't have that. We're talking about 1,600 units here. So I think this project does get done or gets approved in some capacity. When it gets done, I don't know. The variances are significant. You're talking about one variance that stood out to me was the minimum lot size for I think a duplex in Kerrville is like 3,600 square feet.
Right.
Now they're asking for 1,200 square feet with the option of going to 45 feet on the height requirement, which I think is 15 feet above what they would normally get. So in residential housing. So now you're talking about some verticality that's unusual in the hill country as well. But I think what's going to end up is the market is so thin of housing that they're going to have to say there's going to be a compromise somewhere at some point. I think they'll get some of those variances, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. Will there be developers who will want to continue this work with the city, balking at some of these things? I don't know the answer to that question at this point.
So I really like your analysis of, it seems like they threw the entire kitchen, the developers threw the entire kitchen sink in. And this is obviously, or at least to me, was their opening offer. And I wish they'd been a little more strategic and tell us what they intended to do rather than ask for everything to start with. And the variance you just articulated about, that was the one that really struck me the most. That it seemed to me, I'm not saying it's right or wrong at this point, but we need to think about that in terms of other new construction in Kerrville.
Right. This is going to be the issue that Texas is going to have to deal with, is that Texas has been blessed or given, huge amounts of land, a lot of it flat. So you can build stuff, a lot of stuff in a hurry. But now it gets down to, quality of life, quality of place, quality of what we think of the hill country. A lot of people think of it as 5-acre ranches or 20-acre ranches or even larger. But there's some people who want to live here who don't care about that at all. So how do you balance that out? And that's going to be the real question. And then at the same time of this is that you have political emotions above the city council, above planning and zoning at the state level, where they sort of feel anti-regulation at all. And how does this play out? How does this happen going forward? Because you're hearing the arguments like from Comanche Trace, that doesn't fit. Well, that's not really an excuse to deny that. It doesn't fit. What does that mean? It doesn't fit your opinion of that. Why does your Tudor style house fit in the hill country? Those kind of questions. So that's going to be the big driver moving forward.
Is it a legitimate position to say we don't want more growth? We want to stay stuck where we're at?
I think it's dangerous. And so that leads me back to another point that I think you have to look at it from the position of how do we manage the growth? How do we manage development? How do we manage property rights? If you say I don't want growth, that's a very California-esque thing to say, because you've historically, I laugh when they say, don't California my Texas. Well, they're already doing it. You're doing it when you say, I don't want to have any more growth. I don't want to have this. And the danger for that is that you get into places that are in areas that are highly desirable where it becomes so expensive to live that no one can afford to live here other than people who have a lot of money. And that's the fundamental change that the hill country faces. Because, think about it, it's like, you hear it all the time, even from Texas. Where would you like to retire? If you can retire anywhere in Texas, where are you going to retire to? Yeah, hill country. Why do I like the hill country? Well, I went to camp, or It's a little bit drier and it's prettier out here. That's why people retire to certain places across the U.S. and then they don't want anybody else to come, and then that drives the prices up. And the next thing you know, look at this. In April, the median home price here was $377,000. There was more $1 million homes sold than houses under $200,000. So that's where we're in danger of that, because then you get to the point, well, you have all these millionaires living here, then where does everyone else live, and who helps them? At some point they're going to need something. They're going to need some service. Who works at Starbucks? Who does this? Who does that? So I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I know it's a huge problem, and we see it. We can go. You can point. You take your finger on the map on the East Coast and the West Coast and say, okay, this is Florida is really expensive here because they don't want any development. They're tired of people coming here. Go away. This is California, where they're like, oh, thank God you're moving out. Move to Texas. Go ahead. That's where we get into some real issues, I think, and we have to be careful of that. Now, we could say, the heck with it, and just be a playground for the wealthy. So
Louis, I was on the lead today, and you had a large part of the show was about the Kerrville Folk Festival. So I was wondering if we might conclude with a few words about what you see for the summer music scene here in Kerrville.
Well, I got to say, though, Tom, you dropped some truth in that conversation, though, because you announced that you had been to the 7th, the 20th. You'd been to that show several times.
Yes.
And so, I know you've been to Kerrville before, but what made you go to the folk festival the first time, 1979?
Graduated from college, wasn't working, heard it was a great show, could camp out for free, and so I came on down. Second time, it was newly married, wife number one, and we came out here. And then the third time, I had a visitor from Denmark, and she liked folk music, and I said, I got the place for you, honey.
There we go.
And there we go.
Perfect. I think it's going to be a great week. 18 days of music. If you think about the music situation here in the next few weeks, we've got the folk festival, which has got an all-star lineup. Sean Colvin's playing, Ray Wiley Hubbard, Edie Brickell and the New Bohemians are playing, Martin Murphy's playing. So it's going to be great, and through June, I think it's June 12th. And then you go into the summer, and then, if you go around here on any given weekend, there's probably a half dozen or more live music acts playing here on the weekends. I know one of Merle Haggard's sons is playing over at Rotting Tree Ranch in Ingram later this in June. And then we go into the 4th of July weekend. You have Reckless Kelly playing Arcadia Live, and then the big 4th of July show with Robert Earl Keen, and that's going to be huge. That will be probably one of the biggest events in Kerrville in the last 10 years, because this farewell show on the 4th of July. So the music situation here is just going to be great.
And that's what really surprised me last summer, was the quality of the local music scene. And if I could brag a little bit about social media, every one of those musicians had their own website, and you could download their songs.
Absolutely.
And we got hooked on going to the Hunt store on Thursday, because they had music out there, and you could smoke outside. My wife smokes. So in her minds, that's very civilized. We could listen to music and met some great local musicians just from that. But there are 10 of those venues every weekend.
Yeah. You have the Hunt store. You have Joanne Marie and me in Ingram. You have the Southern Sky Music Cafe, which has a new location in Ingram. You have Pine and Plow, La Escondida, Arcadia Live. McCallow's got higher end traveling musicians that come in. You have Trailhead. You've got music everywhere, and it's really quite something. And the folk festival has got people from all over the world coming to it, and it's really good. And you have emerging artists here too. There was a guy who was in the coffee house today as we were doing the lead, named Landon Lloyd Miller, who is a wine and coffee guy, but he's also got a record deal, and he's a really fantastic Americana singer, songwriter, and become a good friend of ours as well. And so, I'm just excited about, like, every week I do my events list, and I'm like, man, there's like 45 things going on this week. There's 18 concerts. Oh my gosh, how do I get to it all? And it's really special right now.
Well, Louis, thanks again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to checking in with you again.
Thank you, Tom.
I love telling stories, and the Hill Country Podcast is designed to do just that. If you have a story you'd like to tell, I'd love to sit down and visit with you. Please contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com, and I'll sit down and visit with you for an episode of the Hill Country Podcast. The Hill Country Podcast is designed to tell the people, places, and things that make this the most unique part of Texas. The Hill Country Podcast is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.